So at the advent of the internet, most people were kind of lauding it as a boon for democracy and discourse through the way that it would allow more disintermediated and direct conversation between the populace. And in many cases, that has been absolutely true, but even at the time when all of this optimism was happening, there was a group of scholars and policymakers who were cautioning that instead of widening the information horizon of its average user, there was a significant risk that due to our own natural predispositions and the power that such a landscape would give to people who could leverage it properly, that this could result in a narrowing of people's viewpoint of the world and the information they interacted with. And that wasn't really directly measured. People discussed it and worried about it for many, many years, but it really didn't start to be measured in a real way until around 2015, 2016. A lot of the work was kicked off by concern surrounding the 2016 election in the US. And that really prompted an explosion in empirical work looking into this question of what I will term homophily and what is kind of popularly coined as echo chambers. So let me first define it. So when I talk about homophily, I'm talking about it in reference to a network. And in the abstract, a network is homophilic if when you assign a quantity to the nodes in the network that has been measured independently of the network structure itself, nodes with similar values of the quantity are more likely to be connected in the network. And that, the fancy word for that I'm going to use is homophily. And the kind of trite way I'll sum it up for the internet is that users of a feather engage together, right? And what we've found, and when I say we here, I mean like the academic community writ large and society through all of this measurement, is that indeed the internet has a very, very, very striking homophilic structure across many platforms, all conversations. It's fairly ubiquitous. And as a mathematician doing my PhD, from kind of a statistical physics point of view, I was very, very struck by that realization, by that measurement, and kind of decided to delve into it a little bit farther. So don't just take my word for it. I'm going to show you some examples. This is one up on the screen right now. So this is actually the Twitter conversation in Mali surrounding the new transition government, which is kind of pretty much everyone knows is a proxy for Russia in the region. And users that have been kind of colored red in this network depiction, and that truly is a network. It's very zoomed out. This is tens of thousands of users. Users are nodes. Edges between them represent their interactions on social media, Twitter in this case. The red users are kind of for the transition government, and the green users still prefer the West as their partner for Mali. This is a measurement that we did at Magi using what we call our faction detection methodology. But I will show you some other examples because strikingly kind of independent of the conversation you look at and independent of the methodology that you use, given that it's sufficiently good, right? People, all sorts of researchers have recovered these types of structures. This is one of the very first ones that I ever saw. So here, the quantity that the network is homophilic with respect to is whether users followed only Trump or only Clinton on Twitter. So if you look at users like that and you look at the network structure of their interaction on Twitter, they very nicely organize themselves into two bubbles, as Scott very nicely termed them. Here's another example, and this is actually joint work with Dr. Cowan, who is going to be speaking later in the conference. This is the conversation surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and this is data taken from the month of May 2023. On the left-hand side, we'll have what I'll broadly term as people who are in support of that movement. And on the right-hand side, we have what maybe I'll call the All Lives Matter faction. And this coloring was done with a different methodology than the faction detection methodology that we use at Magi, but related and relies heavily on the content of what people post. So it completely ignores the network structure. It does the coloring based on what they have said in this month, and then map the network, put the colors on top, and this is what you find. This one you can't see so well, but this is a conversation surrounding the war in Ukraine from 1 week in August of this year. Left-hand side, you have kind of your pro-Russia faction. Right-hand side, you have your pro-Ukrainian faction. And again, you can see the structure that it takes. So I was supposed to talk about influence in this talk, which is what I will do. This is a measurement that we did at Magi in Libya. We're pretty good at finding inauthentically coordinated accounts and then attributing their narratives. So these are the accounts operating in Libya that we found are pushing pro-Russian narratives. And so this is a different data collection methodology than the previous examples. We are not collecting from a conversation, right? We are following a group of accounts that we identified. But strikingly, they organize themselves into the same structure. Why might that be? We would posit it's because they are taking advantage of this kind of structural phenomena that the online space has. And indeed, we see that as well in the US. This is much older data, kind of from more of the beginnings of our pursuits. But again, we see the same pattern. This is conversation surrounding the gun control debate in the US in May of 2020. The yellow colored accounts are accounts that we found to be inauthentically coordinated, not using the platform in the way that a normal user would. And you see that they have inserted themselves directly at the center of both of the factions of this debate. So there's the data. So now I'm going to kind of veer more into effects and mechanisms, and then some modeling that can maybe explain the mechanisms of how these structures present a little bit more. So first of all, homophilia is bad, mostly, in discourse. That's mostly what this slide says. But specifically, it's bad because, as I said, users have a greatly narrowed information landscape, obviously. It's especially bad because, as you can see, the stance of a cluster is easily characterized and easily weaponized and leveraged. Viral cascades, if you study cascades, they occur mostly in homophilic clusters, actually to the point where there's a lot of evidence that a certain degree of homophilia is actually a necessary condition for a cascade to occur. And the reason for that is the more aligned content is with the ideology of a cluster, the more likely it is to go viral, completely independent of how true it is. That's been measured by several people. And what's worse, false information has been found to create much larger cascades on average than true information. And that kind of, given the structural thing that I just said, that kind of suggests two reasons for that are probably working in concert. One, that information is seeded in clusters that are more homophilic, more tightly connected together, and that content, because it is false, can be crafted to fit the ideology of that cluster more closely than the truth, which, as we all know, is usually a little more subtle. So this is bad news. If you I'm sure some people in the room have heard of the law of group polarization. So homophily now will beget more homophily in the future. If you take a bunch of people who are pro Second Amendment rights and you put them in a room and you tell them to talk about gun control, they're not going to come out of that room wanting more gun control, right? The same is true with the opposite of that side of the debate. And all of this together says that this structure is very susceptible to malign influence for those who would want to leverage this to spread their own views or ideology. So this is what I'm going to call local mechanisms of what might be causing this structure. This is at kind of like the interpersonal level, at the direct interaction. So at first, right, and this is still a popular notion, we blamed the platforms, right? We said they are putting us into filter bubbles, they are measuring our profile and serving us content through black magic that is going to make us hate each other. And that is true to an extent. Yes, they do that. Using platforms cuts down on your viewing of what is termed cross-cutting content by on the order of 10 to 15%, depending on who measures it. So that does happen. But I will tell you, as someone who works in AI, that notion of the perfectly primed piece of content based on some measurement that you take off of someone's activity, that is a very hard thing to do. So the platforms are at fault, but not completely. There's much evidence that the main driver of this phenomenon is actually our own predispositions, right? So this is kind of a very well-studied phenomenon in the offline context. Call it confirmation bias, call it selective exposure. We like what we like prior, and we are more apt to pay attention to things that align with that than other stuff, right? So even if you're getting, there's much evidence for this if you look at engagement data from news feeds or whatever. Even if you're being served a lot of cross-cutting content, all it takes to ignore it is that, right? So, maybe not so impactful. So my kind of main thesis here with this slide is that the scale and speed of the internet is a kind of steroid for our own natural predisposition. So given infinite information and finite time to consume it, what does one do, right? That it's, pretty, when you think about it that way, I won't say it seems obvious, but, you start to blame the platforms a little bit less. I'm not a fan of them, but I want to be honest about what is driving this. Okay, so, but local mechanisms are great. Very interesting. They explain a lot, right? But as a mathematician, and especially from someone from a statistical physics background, we've been talking a lot about complexity at this conference. What I am interested in is how those local interactions manifest in a global structure. So what are the global mechanisms behind why these structures are forming at the scales that they are? Because those conversations are very stable in time. Those bubbles maintain for weeks and weeks and months and months and months. And to me, that is, somewhat surprising. That is an example of what is deemed self-organized behavior. We're in a disintermediated environment. We are putting ourselves in those bubbles. So I am interested in using modeling not as a way to predict what's going to happen. I don't think that is likely possible at this stage, but I'll talk about that a little bit later if I have time. I'm interested in using idealized modeling to uncover, in best and worst case scenarios, to kind of uncover possible mechanisms that might be driving this in reality. So kind of an upper or lower bound on reality, if you like, right? So that's the one equation I'll put up during this talk, but I'll read it to you in English, right? The change in an individual's opinion is equal to a weighted sum of the influence to which that person is connected in some sort of network, right? So, and the way that we deal with that theoretically, the way that we model these local interactions is through what's called an interaction function, which prescribes one if two individuals interact in the network, right? This is a network that evolves in time. It is not static like a real social network. And it prescribes the result of that interaction after it occurs, right? So we idealize stance away into some continuous value that we describe with an equation like this, and then we try to prescribe interaction rules that we think are putting a bound on reality, if you like, right? Describing a best or worst case so that we can at least say, okay, we know that in the best case this happens. We're not in the best case in the real world, so if it's still bad in the best case, it's likely not great in the real world as well, right? So I'm going to describe one of those kind of best case scenarios for you, and it's called the bounded confidence model. And this is a model that kind of attempts to capture a flavor of confirmation bias a little bit, but it essentially says that, okay, I'm maximally confident in everyone I interact with in the sense that if we interact, our opinions will move close to each other. But that confidence has a bound. If our opinions are far enough away, we don't interact at all and don't influence each other at all, right? So ubiquitously, right, what occurs in this model is convergence to clusters of opinions and a disconnected interaction network, right? Which is not exactly what I showed you in the data, but that's okay. This is an idealized scenario, and this is a best case. We can only agree, and we agree within a threshold, right? Just to have that flavor of selection bias in there. So the first question that we ask is, okay, you know, we don't have consensus here, but neither do we have growing polarization, right? So a question that we ask is, what might we do? How do we change the people in this scenario so that maybe they can agree, right? This is quite an easy control problem to solve if you have an agent that knows what everyone's opinion is and can herd them up like a sheepdog, but that's cheating. Here we've decided, okay, each agent is only aware of its local neighborhood, right? What do they have to do to get to consensus, right? And the thing that they have to do is just have a little bit of a local moderating tendency. So most of the time, right, and you can see this is the same exact initial condition from the previous model. So most of the time, they evolve according to the regular bounded confidence dynamics, except if they sense that they are about to disconnect, get outside of the opinion threshold of one of their neighbors, right? And then they stop. They wait for their neighbor to catch up or move closer to them, and then they resume evolving again. So what this results in is that you get to a consensus every time. No matter what, it can just take a very long time. So again, I was supposed to talk about influence, so now I've kind of set up the ideal situation, and now I would like to introduce what I will deem as polarizing agents to this world. And a polarizing agent is an agent that can exert influence on those interacting in the network, but it does not change its position or stance at all in response to any sort of influence from the regular population. It just takes a stance and holds it. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but in that bottom plot, that's the one that I want to focus on here, we have polarizing agents that are taking the extreme position of the spectrum, right? And again, this is the same exact initial condition that I showed you in the previous two slides. What happens here is, and importantly, the agents here have the moderating tendency that I described. So they are like perfect discourse agents, right? They always agree, and they want to maintain connection with each other. And despite that, in this best case scenario, the polarizing agents still win in the sense that they manage to attract most of the population to their position. And the mechanism for that is that locally everyone's happy because the moderators make them feel like their interaction network is still connected. They're not breaking up with anyone, but they move as a group to the polarizing position, right? So this is just an example of the type of insight that I think is that you can kind of draw out of modeling like this, a global mechanism for how polarization can happen in a perfect world, right? So, and I'll go back to this gun control plot again. This, I would say, I do feel that this is connected to the data in a pretty strong way, because if that dynamic did not exist to some extent, then adversaries would not employ an exactly analogous strategy in the real world to good effect by much evidence, which we've heard a lot of in the past couple days. So what's next in this type of pursuit? One thing, for example, that's dissatisfactory about a bounded confidence model is it does not have the possibility for negative interactions, repulsive interactions. If you don't like someone, you just ignore each other and don't interact at all. There's much evidence that that is not what these networks really look like, right? All of that crosstalk, that is not happy talk. So the ubiquitous kind of structure is this network on the right. So we would like to and have introduced that into our modeling. And what is interesting that when you do that, the bounded confidence model, absent of that moderating tendency, can only really do two things. It does consensus or it does clusters that don't further polarize. When you introduce the notion of repulsion or an interaction that results in people disagreeing more, which we all know those exist, we've all had them, it results in a much richer model that is capable of displaying a much wider degree of behaviors. We still have polarization, but now we have consensus to an extreme. We still have neutral consensus, but now we have a regime in which no one can really decide what they think, right? On the left side, in a normative social network, we also see what I would say is a normative distribution of opinions. And without this repulsion, right, you don't see any of that in the earlier models. So the other thing that's next is, okay, we can measure the networks really well. We know that the modeling that we've done corresponds to the networks that we measure in the data to a pretty good degree by several measures. But one thing that we don't have such a good handle on, right, and why this type of work is right now, as I say, only good for uncovering idealized mechanisms, is I would say we don't have the best handle on how to measure someone's stance on an issue, right? So for politics and elections and things like this, it's easy. You can do what I call the link to labels strategy, right? You have figures who are representing the stance. You compute someone's stance based on how much they engage with those figures. For, I don't know, let's say a conversation about immigration in the US, right? What do you do there? And we would claim that the best, or our best swing at that, or our hypothesis right now, is that the best way to get at stance is to look at engagement in narratives that are driven by sacred values, right? And our evidence for that is that, okay, so first we went and looked for conversations about just sacred values like family safety, security, homeland. So looking for the conversation about homeland and family safety versus looking at the conversation about immigration into your country and how that interacts with things. So one is like kind of a meta value, the other is a specific instance of it where the value manifests, right? And when we look at conversations like that, and we look at the values that occur in them, this is an example of this on the left, what we find is that the sacred values are always central to these narratives, right? So we think that that might be a good way at getting at some type of way to quantify that idealized stance quantity, which I talked about in the modeling. And then once you do that, if you actually have a handle on how to measure stance, right, you can then get to suggesting efficient moderation strategies, right? So every platform right now has its notion of moderation. Facebook pays a bunch of people, well, except for Twitter, kind of. Facebook pays a bunch of people to have butts in seats, right? Reddit uses brainwashed labor and its volunteer moderators and so on and so forth, right? But the point is that none of these people really know what to do, right? They are fighting a very intractable battle, and they're being yelled at all of the time with good reason, right? But they have not been given any sort of handhold to hold on to kind of attack this problem. I think that if you can get to a place where you can measure stance well, you can start to experiment with these types of strategies because you can monitor effects of what you do, right? Right now, there is not much we can do to measure whether we're making the problem better absent looking at the network structure. It would be better if we have a measure of discourse, right? What this type of approach can definitely do is characterize the narratives that are being scaled, right? So to me, that's kind of the danger here, and also why AI in this space is especially dangerous, right? I hope I've convinced you that these bubbles are susceptible to influence. Now we can kind of, a sufficiently motivated and funded actor can scale that influence arbitrarily, right? That's not a great state of reality, right? But on the flip side, it can be used to combat the problem by being able to detect and measure the narratives that are being scaled and are being pushed in bad faith.